Autumn 1943. On a humid airfield in Rabaul, Japan's greatest fighter aces are reading an intelligence report about a new American fighter. They call it the Hellcat, and they're laughing. What they don't know is that their laughter is about to become the prelude to the complete destruction of Japanese air superiority in the Pacific. Among those men reading that report is Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, a living legend. Just a year earlier, over Guadalcanal, enemy fire tore through his cockpit. A bullet grazed his skull. Shattered glass destroyed his right eye. Blind in one eye, bleeding, barely conscious, he flew his damaged Zero for nearly 5 hours, 560 nautical miles, and brought it home. They called it a miracle. Now he's a trainer, and his one good eye scans the specifications of this new American machine. The weight catches his attention first, nearly 12,000 pounds, almost twice the weight of his beloved Zero. He laughs. The other pilots around him laugh too. To Sakai and his fellow aviators, this is typical American thinking, clumsy, wasteful, trying to replace skill and finesse with raw machinery and brute force. Outside the tent, sleek Zeros sit on the tarmac, beautiful machines, elegant, deadly. For 2 solid years, they've given Japan absolute air superiority across the Pacific. They're lightweight, agile, and in the hands of skilled pilots, utterly devastating. They're the steel embodiment of the samurai spirit, a philosophy that values precision, discipline, and the warrior's will above all else. This new Hellcat? Just another heavy, clumsy American attempt to compete, just another target. But what Sakai doesn't know, what none of them can possibly understand in that moment, is that the Americans aren't trying to build a better duelist. They're not interested in fighting fair. They're building something entirely different. They're turning air combat from an art form, from a contest between warriors, into an industry, into a systematic, overwhelming force. To understand why they're laughing, you need to understand the Zero. You need to understand what it meant in 1941 when the Mitsubishi A6M Zero first arrived in Pacific skies. It was like nothing the Allies had ever seen. It was a revelation, a nightmare. The Zero could outturn anything the Americans or British could field. The P-40 Warhawk, the F4F Wildcat, the Brewster Buffalo. One by one, they faced the Zero in combat and lost. Pilots who survived encounters came back shaken, talking about an enemy fighter that seemed to defy physics. It could turn inside your turn radius. It could climb faster. It had range that shouldn't have been possible for a fighter aircraft. But this wasn't just about the machine. The men flying these Zeros were among the most highly trained military pilots in the world. Japanese naval aviators in 1941 averaged over 700 hours of flight time. 700 hours! Compare that to many American pilots who were being rushed into combat with barely 200. And much of that Japanese training was actual combat experience earned in the brutal skies over China during the Second Sino-Japanese War. These weren't rookies learning on the job. They were warrior elites raised in the Bushido tradition, viewing air combat as a personal contest of will, honor, and skill. Saburo Sakai embodied this philosophy perfectly. Born into poverty, he clawed his way into the naval aviation program through sheer determination. He trained relentlessly. He studied every aspect of aerial combat. He became one of the most feared and respected aces in the Japanese Navy. Relentless, disciplined, nearly untouchable in the air. And the combat statistics backed up their confidence. Over the Philippines in late 1941, Japanese pilots destroyed American aircraft at a staggering rate while suffering minimal losses themselves. The Zero shocked Allied intelligence. It had the range of a bomber, allowing it to escort strikes deep into enemy territory, something fighter aircraft weren't supposed to be able to do. Yet it retained the agility of a biplane from the previous war. It seemed to defy every established rule of aircraft design. Allied pilots who tried to dogfight with a Zero on its own terms, who tried to get into a turning engagement, didn't last long. The Zero would outturn them, get into position behind them, and a burst from its twin 20mm cannons would end the fight quickly, often fatally. The psychological impact on Allied pilots was crushing. Many felt they were flying inferior machines into combat against a superior enemy. They felt fundamentally outmatched. The F6F Wildcat, the Navy's primary carrier-based fighter in the early war, was a tough little airplane. Grumman built it like a tank. Pilots affectionately called it a product of the Grumman Iron Works because it could absorb punishment that would tear apart lighter aircraft. It could take damage that would shred a Zero into pieces and still bring its pilot home. But it was significantly slower than the Zero, less agile, couldn't climb as well. In a straight-up dogfight, the Wildcat was at a severe disadvantage. Wildcat pilots developed clever survival tactics. The most famous was the Tatch Weave, invented by Lieutenant Commander John Tatch. Two Wildcat fighters would fly in a weaving pattern, crossing paths repeatedly. If a Zero got on one Wildcat's tail, the other would turn toward the enemy, forcing the Zero pilot to either break off his attack or fly directly into the second Wildcat's guns. It was brilliant defensive flying, but these were tactics designed for survival, ways to reduce losses and occasionally get a kill, not ways to dominate the sky, not ways to win air superiority. The Wildcat pilots were fighting defensively, trying to not lose too badly until something better came along. So when the Japanese pilots in that tent in Rabaul read the intelligence report about the Hellcat and burst into laughter, it wasn't simple arrogance, it wasn't blind foolishness, it was confidence earned for 2 years of aerial dominance. They had beaten everything the Allies threw at them. They had every logical reason to believe the trend would continue, that their superior training and their magnificent Zero would keep them masters of the Pacific sky. What they couldn't see, what their entire military culture prevented them from understanding, is that the Americans aren't trying to build a better duelist. They're not interested in fighting fair. They're building something entirely different. They're turning air combat from an art form, from a contest between warriors, into an industry, into a systematic, overwhelming force. To understand why they're laughing, you need to understand the Zero. You need to understand what it meant in 1941 when the Mitsubishi A6M Zero first arrived in Pacific skies. It was like nothing the Allies had ever seen. It was a revelation, a nightmare. The Zero could outturn anything the Americans or British could field. The P-40 Warhawk, the F-4F Wildcat, the Brewster Buffalo. One by one, they faced the Zero in combat and lost. Pilots who survived encounters came back shaken, talking about an enemy fighter that seemed to defy physics. It could turn inside your turn radius. It could climb faster. It had range that shouldn't have been possible for a fighter aircraft. But this wasn't just about the machine. The men flying these Zeros were among the most highly trained military pilots in the world. Japanese naval aviators in 1941 averaged over 700 hours of flight time. 700 hours! Compare that to many American pilots who were being rushed into combat with barely 200. And much of that Japanese training was actual combat experience, earned in the brutal skies over China during the Second Sino-Japanese War. These weren't rookies learning on the job. They were warrior elites, raised in the Bushido tradition, viewing air combat as a personal contest of will, honor, and skill. Saburo Sakai embodied this philosophy perfectly. Born into poverty, he clawed his way into the naval aviation program through sheer determination. He trained relentlessly. He studied every aspect of aerial combat. He became one of the most feared and respected aces in the Japanese Navy, relentless, disciplined, nearly untouchable in the air. And the combat statistics backed up their confidence. Over the Philippines in late 1941, Japanese pilots destroyed American aircraft at a staggering rate while suffering minimal losses themselves. The Zero shocked Allied intelligence. It had the range of a bomber, allowing it to escort strikes deep into enemy territory, something fighter aircraft weren't supposed to be able to do. Yet it retained the agility of a biplane from the previous war. It seemed to defy every established rule of aircraft design. Allied pilots who tried to dogfight with a Zero on its own terms, who tried to get into a turning engagement, didn't last long. The Zero would outturn them, get into position behind them, and a burst from its twin 20mm cannons would end the fight quickly, often fatally. The psychological impact on Allied pilots was crushing. Many felt they were flying inferior machines into combat against a superior enemy. They felt fundamentally outmatched. The F4F Wildcat, the Navy's. For the first time, American engineers could thoroughly examine their opponent's technology. They could see exactly how the Zero achieved its remarkable performance. And they could see exactly what compromises the Japanese had made to get there. The Zero was a marvel of lightweight engineering. Every possible ounce had been trimmed. But to achieve that low weight, the designers had sacrificed pilot protection, robust construction, even effective radio equipment. What the Japanese saw as a philosophy of perfection, of purity in design, American engineers at Grumman saw as critical, exploitable vulnerability. The blueprint for the Zero's countermeasure crystallized. Leroy Grumman and his engineering team made a fundamental decision. They would not try to build a fighter that could outturn the Zero. That was a losing strategy. The Zero's low wing loading and light weight gave it a turning advantage that would be nearly impossible to match without making similar compromises. And the Americans weren't willing to send their pilots into combat in unarmored aircraft with unprotected fuel tanks. The philosophy was different. American industrial culture valued the life of the operator. A dead pilot represents not just a human tragedy, but a massive waste of training investment and accumulated combat experience. So Grumman decided to build a heavyweight brawler, a fighter that wouldn't try to dance with the Zero. Instead, it would use raw power, overwhelming firepower, and extreme structural toughness to dictate the terms of every engagement. The design that emerged, which would become the F6F Hellcat, embodied this philosophy completely. At its heart was the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine. This was an 18-cylinder, two-row radial engine that produced over 2,000 horsepower. It was a monster. This engine became the philosophical core of the entire aircraft. It would give the Hellcat the power to climb rapidly above enemy fighters. It would give it the speed to dive down on them at will. And critically, it would give Hellcat pilots the ability to engage and disengage on their own terms. If a fight looked bad, if the odds turned against them, they could simply use their superior speed to escape. No shame in it, just tactical flexibility and survival. The airframe wrapped around this engine was built with classic Grumman toughness. The company's design philosophy was simple and unwavering. Build planes that bring their pilots home. The Hellcat carried over 200 pounds of armor plating, strategically positioned around the cockpit and engine. The fuel tanks were self-sealing, using a rubber compound that would swell when punctured by bullets, automatically plugging the holes and preventing catastrophic fires. The windscreen was thick, bullet-resistant glass. Even the oil cooler and other vital systems had protective armor. This meant Hellcat pilots would routinely come back from missions in aircraft that looked like they'd been through a shredder. Wings riddled with bullet holes, fuselage torn by cannon shells, tail surfaces shredded. And they would walk away uninjured, climb out of the cockpit, and fly again the next day. This survivability wasn't just good for morale, it was strategically critical. It meant experienced pilots stayed in combat, accumulating hundreds of flight hours, learning enemy tactics, becoming more and more effective. The Hellcat preserved America's most valuable combat asset, the trained, experienced aviator. And those pilots had a truly devastating weapon system at their disposal. The Hellcat mounted 6 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing. Each gun could fire approximately 800 rounds per minute. When all 6 fired simultaneously, they created a cone of heavy bullets that could saw through enemy aircraft. The 50 caliber round was devastating against the Zero's unprotected structure. American pilots were specifically trained to aim for the Zero's wings, where the main fuel tanks were located. One good, sustained burst into that area, and the fragile Zero would often explode or burst into flames. When the first detailed intelligence reports on the Hellcat reached Japan in late 1943, they were met with a mixture of disbelief and open mockery. Japanese intelligence analysts looked at the specifications. Weight, over 12,000 pounds fully loaded. The Zero weighed barely 6,000 pounds. Their analysis concluded that the Hellcat would be sluggish and unmaneuverable. Their entire tactical doctrine, their entire training philosophy was based on the turning dogfight. By their calculations, by their understanding of air combat, the Hellcat simply couldn't compete. And by the standards of traditional dogfighting, they were absolutely correct. The Zero had virtually no chance in a sustained turning engagement with the Hellcat. The Zero could turn inside the Hellcat's turn radius all day long. The catastrophic flaw in Japanese strategic thinking was assuming the Hellcat would ever be stupid enough to try. The Americans had studied the Zero, they understood its advantages, and they had designed the Hellcat specifically to avoid fighting on the Zero's terms. The Hellcat would never get into a slow-speed turning fight with the Zero. That wasn't the plan. The plan was something entirely different. This misunderstanding was compounded by a growing catastrophic gap in pilot quality. Japan's pool of elite veteran aviators was being steadily depleted through attrition. Combat losses, training accidents, disease in tropical postings. The rigorous years-long training program that had created men like Saburo Sakai simply couldn't keep pace with the losses. The Japanese military was designed for a short, decisive conflict. It wasn't designed for a grinding war of attrition against an industrial superpower. By 1944, new Japanese pilots were being rushed to frontline units with a fraction of the training their predecessors had received. Some arrived at combat squadrons with as little as 100 flight hours. They were barely competent to fly the aircraft, let alone master complex air combat tactics. Meanwhile, the United States had turned pilot training into an industrial production line. New American naval aviators arrived in the Pacific Theater with 500 to 600 flight hours. Many had over 200 hours specifically in the F6F Hellcat, practicing the exact tactics they would use in combat. They had trained against American pilots flying captured Zeros, learning precisely how to exploit every weakness. The Americans weren't just building better planes, they were mass-producing better prepared, better equipped pilots. The stage was set for a dramatic reversal of fortune. The laughter in that tent in Rabaul was about to turn into something very different. But before I tell you exactly how this heavyweight monster systematically dismantled Japanese air power and changed the entire course of the Pacific War, if you're enjoying this deep dive into one of World War II's greatest engineering and tactical triumphs, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss these incredible untold stories of innovation, strategy, and warfare. Now, here's where the story gets absolutely insane. When Grumman F6F Hellcats started arriving on American carriers in mid-1943, they were everything the Zero was not. Lined up on a carrier deck, the Hellcat lacked any aesthetic grace. It was wide, barrel-chested, squat, and brutally functional. It looked exactly like the heavyweight the Japanese intelligence reports had described and dismissed. But this machine was the product of cold, calculated, systematic American engineering married to combat experience, and it was about to rewrite the rules of Pacific air warfare. At the core of every Hellcat was that incredible power plant, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, reliably churning out over 2,000 horsepower, gave the Hellcat performance characteristics that shocked Japanese pilots when they first encountered it. The Hellcat had a phenomenal rate of climb, especially at altitudes above 15,000 feet, where the Zero's engine started to lose power. It had impressive maximum speed, particularly in level flight and in dives. This combination of power and speed gave Hellcat pilots the ultimate tactical advantage in any form of combat, the ability to control the engagement. They could choose when to fight. They could choose when to run. They dictated the terms. If a fight looked advantageous, they could press the attack with overwhelming force. If the situation turned bad, if they were outnumbered or caught in a disadvantageous position, they could simply pour on the power and escape. No Japanese fighter could catch a Hellcat in level flight or a dive if the American pilot wanted to leave. The airframe was pure Grumman philosophy: tough, reliable, protective. More than 200 pounds of hardened steel armor plating strategically positioned throughout the aircraft. Armor behind the pilot's seat and headrest, armor in front of the cockpit protecting the engine and oil systems. The fuel tank system was self-sealing. When bullets punctured the tanks, the special rubber lining would swell on contact with fuel, automatically plugging the holes within seconds. This single feature saved countless lives. Zeros would often explode when their unprotected tanks were hit. Hellcats would take dozens of hits and keep flying. Stories circulated throughout the Pacific Fleet of Hellcats returning to their carriers looking like flying wrecks. Wings so full of holes they looked like Swiss cheese. Fuselage panels torn away by cannon shells. Tail sections shredded by enemy fire. And the pilot would climb out, shaken but uninjured, ready to fly again after the plane was patched up. This level of survivability transformed the psychological dynamic of air combat. Wildcat pilots had fought with the constant awareness that they were vulnerable, that their aircraft couldn't protect them from enemy fire. Hellcat pilots flew with confidence, knowing their machine would do everything possible to keep them alive. When the first intelligence reports on actual Hellcat combat performance reached Japanese command in late 1943, they caused confusion and concern. The descriptions didn't match the predictions. The Hellcat wasn't sluggish. It was described as fast, even frighteningly fast. It wouldn't engage in traditional turning dogfights. Japanese pilots reported that Hellcats would appear suddenly from above, attack with devastating firepower, and then vanish back into the sky before the Zeros could effectively respond. It was a new form of air combat, systematic, clinical, brutally effective. The tactic was called boom and zoom, and it had been developed by American and British pilots fighting in Europe, refined by men like Major John Boyd decades later into what would become energy fighting doctrine. A Hellcat pilot, or preferably a flight of Hellcats working together, would use their powerful engines to climb well above the expected combat altitude. From that perch, they had both a tactical and energy advantage. They could see the battlefield below them. They could choose their targets carefully. And when the moment was right, they would roll over and plunge downward, trading altitude for speed. The Hellcat would accelerate rapidly in the dive, reaching speeds where the Zero simply couldn't follow effectively. At over 400 knots, the Zero's control surfaces would become extremely stiff. Japanese pilots would find themselves unable to make the sharp corrections needed to track a fast-moving target. The Hellcat would scream through the enemy formation in a single devastating high-speed pass. 6 50-caliber machine guns would open up for just a few seconds. That brief burst would be enough. Zeros would erupt in flames, spin out of control, or simply disintegrate under the massive weight of fire. Then, using the speed from the dive and the power from that massive engine, the Hellcat would climb rapidly back up to altitude, zooming back to safety. The Japanese pilots below would barely have time to react. By the time they turned to pursue, the Hellcat was already thousands of feet above them, setting up for another attack. The Zero's greatest strength, its incredible turning ability, became irrelevant. You can't outturn an enemy who refuses to turn with you. And there was the thatch weave, that defensive tactic invented by Wildcat pilots, now transformed into a lethal offensive weapon in the hands of Hellcat squadrons. Two Hellcats would fly in a mutual support pattern. If a Zero managed to get on one Hellcat's tail, a dangerous position, the targeted pilot would immediately turn toward his wingman. The wingman would simultaneously turn toward his partner. The two Hellcats would cross paths, weaving together. The Zero pilot, focused on his target, would suddenly find himself flying directly into the gun sight of the second Hellcat. He would have a split second to decide, break off the attack and lose his chance, or continue and fly into a stream of .50 caliber fire. Most didn't have time to react. The weave was simple. It was practiced endlessly in training, and in combat it was brutally, efficiently lethal. The psychological impact on Japanese naval aviation was profound and devastating. Pilots who had been the undisputed masters of the Pacific sky for 2 years were now facing relentless, overwhelming pressure. Their after-action reports, the ones that survived, were filled with frustration and disbelief. The new American fighter wasn't the clumsy machine they expected. It was fast, far faster than intelligence had predicted. It was tough, absorbing damage that would destroy a Zero and continuing to fight. And most disturbingly of all, it wouldn't fight honorably. It wouldn't engage in the traditional turning dogfight that Japanese pilots had trained for their entire careers. The Hellcat just appeared suddenly from above, killed with mechanical efficiency, and disappeared. There was no contest of skill, no test of will, just sudden, violent death delivered from the sky. Against the Zero, which had once seemed invincible, the Hellcat quickly established a victory ratio that defied belief. For every Hellcat lost in air-to-air combat, Japanese forces would lose 15, 18, sometimes 20 aircraft. This wasn't just statistical superiority, this was systematic dominance. And the losses were cumulative, irreplaceable. Every veteran Japanese pilot who died took decades of training and irreplaceable combat experience with him. The replacements arriving from Japan were poorly trained, inexperienced, and flying into a meat grinder. This building sense of dread, this realization that they were losing control of the sky, finally culminated on June 19, 1944. A single day that would become one of the most disastrous in the entire history of Japanese naval aviation, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. It was supposed to be Japan's great counterstrike, Operation A-Go. The plan was to use land-based aircraft from bases in the Philippines and the Marianas in conjunction with carrier-based aircraft to deliver a decisive blow to the American Fifth Fleet. Nearly 450 Japanese aircraft were committed to the attack. It was one of the largest aerial armadas Japan had assembled since the war began. Japanese commanders hoped to replicate the stunning victories of 1941 and early 1942. They were about to experience the exact opposite. American radar technology had advanced significantly. The ships of Task Force 58 detected the incoming Japanese strike waves when they were still over 100 miles away. This gave Admiral Mark Mitcher and his staff ample time to prepare a reception. Hundreds of F6F Hellcats were launched from American carriers and guided into position by radar-equipped fighter director officers aboard the ships. This level of coordination, this systematic integration of technology and tactics was something that Japanese simply couldn't match. Their radar technology was years behind. Their coordination between ships and aircraft was ad hoc at best. What happened over the Philippine Sea that day wasn't a battle in the traditional sense. It was systematic annihilation. The American Hellcat pilots, expertly guided by their controllers, positioned themselves perfectly to intercept each Japanese strike wave as it approached. The Japanese formations, many led by inexperienced pilots who had never seen combat before, flew into carefully orchestrated defensive screens of Hellcats, and the Hellcats tore them apart. One American pilot, in a radio transmission that would become famous, reported back to his carrier, "Why, hell, it was just like an old-time turkey shoot down home." The comparison was apt. The Japanese formations were being shot down with such ease that it resembled shooting slow-moving, predictable targets. The name stuck immediately. The Battle of the Philippine Sea became known forever after as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The casualty figures tell the story with brutal clarity. Over the course of the first day of battle, Japanese naval aviation lost more than 300 aircraft. 300! Against American losses of approximately 30 planes. Many of those lost. He had taught them everything he knew, the art of the dogfight, the tactics that had made him an ace, the warrior spirit that had carried him through dozens of successful engagements. And now he listened to the shattered, traumatized reports from the few who made it back. They described a blue American fighter that couldn't be outturned because it wouldn't try to turn, that couldn't be caught because it was too fast, that wouldn't die because it was too tough. They described watching their friends and wingmen explode in midair, shot to pieces by overwhelming firepower before they could even react. The laughter in that operations tent a year earlier had curdled into something bitter and terrible. The realization of a master craftsman watching his art become obsolete in real time. The agony of sending students into battles they couldn't win with skills that no longer mattered. Sakai was witnessing the end of an era. The age of the aerial warrior, the individual pilot as artist and duelist, was ending. It was being replaced by something industrial, systematic, overwhelming. The Hellcat didn't care about honor or skill. It simply killed with mechanical efficiency. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was the Hellcat's most famous moment, the engagement that secured its place in history. But its job wasn't done. For the remaining 14 months of the Pacific War, the F6F Hellcat remained the dominant American fighter in every theater. The final statistics are almost difficult to believe. Over approximately 2 years of primary combat service, from mid-1943 to the end of the war in August 1945, the F6F Hellcat was officially credited with destroying 5,223 enemy aircraft. This represented 56%, more than half, of all United States Navy and Marine Corps air-to-air victories in the entire Second World War. Every other American fighter type combined, the Corsair, the Wildcat, everything, accounted for the remaining 44%. Against those thousands of aerial victories, only 270 Hellcats were lost in air-to-air combat. 270! The overall kill-to-loss ratio was approximately 19-1. For every Hellcat shot down by an enemy fighter, 19 enemy aircraft were destroyed. These numbers are so lopsided they almost seem fictional, but they're documented in official records, verified by gun camera footage, confirmed by Japanese records after the war. The Hellcat earned another nickname among the pilots who flew it. They called it the Ace Maker. During the war, an astounding 305 United States Navy and Marine Corps pilots achieved ace status, 5 or more confirmed aerial victories, while flying the F6F Hellcat. More aces were created in the Hellcat than in any other American fighter aircraft of the war. Men like Captain David McCampbell, who became the Navy's top ace with 34 confirmed victories, all achieved while flying Hellcats. Commander Cecil Harris with 24 victories, Lieutenant Commander Alexander Vrasiu with 19. These men became legends. But the Hellcat's greatest achievement wasn't creating aces, it was bringing pilots home. The airplane was forgiving, it was stable, it was an excellent gun platform, easy to aim and fire accurately, and above all, it protected its pilot. This meant that pilots survived their first few missions, the most dangerous period where inexperience gets you killed. They accumulated combat experience, they learned enemy tactics, they became more effective with every mission. The Hellcat created a self-reinforcing cycle of success. For Japan, the consequences were catastrophic and irreversible. The steady attrition of veteran pilots became a hemorrhage they simply couldn't stop.
By late 1944, the pre-war cadre of elite, combat-experienced naval aviators had been effectively wiped out. The few survivors, men like Sakai, were instructors or staff officers, too valuable or too injured to risk in combat. The replacements were undertrained, overmatched, and died quickly. This desperate situation led directly to Japan's most infamous and tragic tactic, the organized kamikaze attacks. When your conventional fighters can no longer compete, when your pilots can no longer survive encounters with enemy aircraft, the final, desperate strategy is to turn the pilot himself into the weapon, use the aircraft as a guided missile. The kamikaze corps was the ultimate admission of defeat in conventional air combat. It was the tragic final chapter of a naval air force that had been systematically dismantled by the Hellcat and the overwhelming industrial and technological superiority it represented. Years after the war ended, Saburo Sakai, who survived to see peace and lived into old age, reflected on the air war. He never lost his respect and affection for the Zero. He saw it as the more elegant machine, a purer expression of aerial combat as art. But he had come to understand a brutal and undeniable truth. In one interview, he reportedly said, "The Zero was the better fighter, but the Hellcat was the better weapon system." That single sentence captures everything. There's another quote often attributed to Sakai, though its exact origin is unclear. Every Japanese pilot who survived the war did so because a Hellcat pilot chose to spare them. Whether Sakai actually said those specific words or not, the sentiment is accurate and profound. That is the ultimate defeat, existing purely at the mercy of your enemy, surviving not because of your skill or your machine, but because your opponent chose not to kill you. Japan brought a beautifully crafted, elegant weapon to an industrialized total war. They believed they were samurai warriors, that their spirit and skill would overcome material disadvantages. The Hellcat proved they were simply men, brave men certainly, but men with obsolescent weapons and outdated tactics facing an unstoppable industrial future. The story of the Hellcat versus the Zero is much more than a comparison of two aircraft. It's the story of two fundamentally different philosophies of warfare colliding at 300 miles per hour in the skies over the Pacific. One philosophy, the Japanese approach, was built on individual skill, supreme agility, and warrior spirit. It was rooted in a belief that the superior man could overcome material disadvantage through will and training. The other philosophy, the American approach, was built on systems, on overwhelming force, on industrial-scale production, and above all, on the principle that the operator, the human being, is the most valuable part of the weapon system and must be protected at all costs. The F6F Hellcat is the perfect embodiment of that American industrial warfare philosophy. It wasn't designed to win individual duels in the sky. It was designed to win a total war. It was heavy because it carried the weight of armor, of a powerful engine, of a comprehensive doctrine that valued a pilot's life above considerations of elegance or purity of design. The Japanese pilots laughed at the intelligence report because they couldn't see beyond the weight. They couldn't understand that every extra pound on the Hellcat represented not a weakness or inefficiency, but a deliberate piece of an integrated weapon system, a system that included radar direction from ships, coordinated tactics between multiple aircraft, superior training programs, and the overwhelming industrial might of a fully mobilized American economy that could simply outproduce any opponent. By the time the laughter stopped, Japan's naval air forces had been effectively marginalized. The aircraft they had mocked, the heavy, clumsy American machine they thought would be easy prey, hadn't just defeated their legendary Zero, it had rendered the Zero's entire design philosophy obsolete. Saburo Sakai, the one-eyed ace who survived, became a living monument to an era of air combat that vanished in the face of industrial precision and systematic warfare. The Hellcat versus the Zero is much more than a comparison of two aircraft. It's the story of two fundamentally different philosophies of warfare colliding at 300 miles per hour in the skies over the Pacific. One philosophy, the Japanese approach, was built on individual skill, supreme agility, and warrior spirit. It was rooted in a belief that the superior man could overcome material disadvantage through will and training. The other philosophy, the American approach, was built on systems, on overwhelming force, on industrial-scale production, and above all, on the principle that the operator, the human being, is the most valuable part of the weapon system and must be protected at all costs. The F6F Hellcat is the perfect embodiment of that American industrial warfare philosophy. It wasn't designed to win individual duels in the sky. It was designed to win a total war. It was heavy because it carried the weight of armor, of a powerful engine, of a comprehensive doctrine that valued a pilot's life above considerations of elegance or purity of design. The Japanese pilots laughed at the intelligence report because they couldn't see beyond the weight. They couldn't understand that every extra pound on the Hellcat represented not a weakness or inefficiency, but a deliberate piece of an integrated weapon system, a system that included radar direction from ships, coordinated tactics between multiple aircraft, superior training programs, and the overwhelming industrial might of a fully mobilized American economy that could simply outproduce any opponent. By the time the laughter stopped, Japan's naval air forces had been effectively marginalized. The aircraft they had mocked, the heavy, clumsy American machine they thought would be easy prey, hadn't just defeated their legendary Zero, it had rendered the Zero's entire design philosophy obsolete. Saburo Sakai,